is Manchester United versus Liverpool.
Or
I'm not going to mention Manchester City. Can we have the Prime Minister to take the floor? Check. Can you all hear me? Ladies and gentlemen, the atrocities in Syria are beyond the imagination of anybody sitting in this room. Assad has turned the military and the regime against the very people of his state. He is turning his armored tanks against innocent villagers, men, women, and children. These atrocities have gone on for too long. The international community has done nothing but pay lip service to the kind of atrocities that have gone on. Side government thinks that something needs to be done and something needs to be done urgently. In my speech today, I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm first going to lay out the model that we propose, and then going to look at a couple of key questions. Why aren't current methods working? Why does Assad need to go? Why will our intervention work? Third, why won't any other methods proposed work? And lastly, why is it the prerogative of the international community to intervene? Let's dive straight away into the model. We have a couple of prongs that I want to explain here. First, the international community and the coalition of the willing must prioritize surgical strikes. So the NATO, the Arab League, Turkey, Qatar, and any other country that is willing to intervene and put forces on the ground. Neutralize the tanks, and you must neutralize the armed convoy that Assad so well uses to go against his own people. Because it's not possible for them to defend against the combined military expertise that NATO, the West, or Qatar, and Turkey or the Arab League possess. The second thing, you must set up a buffer zone for Syria, for people escaping at the Syria-Turkey border, which means you must facilitate refugees, you must set up missions for humanitarian aid. This is the buffer zone where you train the rebels who want to be trained, but if they aren't enough, then we are ready to put our own soldiers on the ground, which is the second option, not the most preferred one. The third thing, preferably you capture members of the regime and you train your soldiers to do that. You capture those who have done these atrocities against them, but if push comes to shove, we are okay with killing the members of this regime because we think they absolutely must go. There is no other alternative in place. Last, if you feel the need, we think you can put UN observers on the ground for post-conflict scenarios in order to establish some sort of working democracy, in order to establish systems that work within this place. But lastly, we also want to set up a national transition council like happened in Libya, which can comprise of members of different communities and ethnicities, which can also have members of the Alawite community, those who have not been part of the regime. So the model is pretty clear. Our stance is this. He has been given enough ways in which to redeem himself. He hasn't shown any positive measures in stopping the kind of atrocities that he has gone on with. We think if he does not go immediately, innocents will continue to die. He must go. Have a seat, sir. So let's look at this. Why aren't current methods working? Because we have tried absolutely everything that we could at this point in time, which means sanctions have been tried, UN envoys have been sent, Arab League observers have been sent, Kofi Annan has himself gone to that place, but he hasn't stopped. What are the kinds of things he has done? Simple eyewash, which means he has promised you he'll stop, but just yesterday in Howrah, 50 innocent children were found dead. We think that's the sort of atrocities that he's willing to engage in. But more than that, initially we were ready to negotiate with him, but right now he shows no signs of making any progress with international community or with observers who go there. Assad knows that he has enough money stashed overseas to carry on the kind of conflict that he needs to carry on. And that is why he is confident of his abilities to carry on the repression that goes on to status quo. Which means if no change is made, this repression will simply wipe out the resistance movement that we see in Syria today. We think that's why international intervention at this point is an absolute must. Let's look at the second point that I want to bring to you. Why will our intervention work? Very first and simple point, because we have better equipment than what Assad possesses in status quo. And I look at this at two levels. Because there are two main suppliers of weapons to Assad today. First, Iran. And Iran simply does not have the kind of weapons expertise that other countries that are willing to engage in this kind of coalition possess. So that's neutralized. But secondly, Russia provides him weapons. And Russia does not want or will not want to provide their A-grade weapons because there's a danger of the Syrian army developing on them or using on them. Which means Russia will only provide their second-hand weapons or their old weapons. We think we have enough to neutralize that. But the second argument is this, that given that there will be some kind of progress made, defections are what we will likely see. Which means the kind of minorities that exist in the army who are not Alawite, do not have some sort of ideological connection with Assad, do not have some sort of long-binding commitment. Which means once we start to have defections is when the army and the very structure that Assad holds dear to the kind of repression that he does will crumble in the first place. We think that is how we make progress under our side of the house. Before we move on, sir.
I think this motion demands that you give us a concrete list of nations which you think will participate in this, and you can't just say, in general, NATO, in general, the UN will agree.
So I trusted side opposition to know which countries are part of the NATO, but I also told you countries like Arab League, countries like Qatar and Turkey, who have showed the willingness to go against Assad and to send their Let's move on. Why don't other methods work? And I'm going to look at 3 methods that could possibly but do not work. First, sanctions. A, they have been imposed for too long, but he hasn't shown anything. And B, the reason that they haven't worked is because he knows he has enough oil money stashed away overseas to carry on the kind of repression that he has carried on. Which means he knows that if no one intervenes in the next few months, it's simple for him to wipe the resistance movement out. What's the second alternative? Offering him amnesty. Even that doesn't work. Because he's confident in his ability to wipe out the resistance movement, and offering amnesty has the danger of him being tried later on. And that is why he won't accept amnesty as well. But the third method is waiting for UN approval and waiting indefinitely, carrying on the kind of backdoor diplomacy that we would ideally have liked. But that doesn't work because there's very little cost to Russia of continuing with status quo. It's rather they who gain money from selling weapons to Assad in the first place. Second, they're also well versed in the art of this kind of diplomatic pressure that the West or other countries might put on them. Which means there's no incentive for Russia to back down in status quo and have some sort of larger coalition in place. We think then even without the UN having some sort of consensus, we need to intervene in this scenario. Let's move on to my last point. Why do we think that the international community has a responsibility? The argument is the responsibility to protect, because we think Assad has completely lost any claims that he can make to sovereignty. Because sovereignty only exists when a leader has the best intentions of his people in mind when he makes those policies. And Assad clearly does not have that when he turns his tanks against the peoples, when he raises down villages for no good rational reason. We think then he has lost the claim to sovereignty. But he has also lost legitimacy as a popular leader because the people don't want him anymore. You see the kind of news that floats around, the kinds of videos where people demand the West to take up some action and to protect their very homes, to protect their lives and to protect their children. Which means in terms of sovereignty and in terms of his claim to having some sort of responsible leadership, he does not have that. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the time to intervene. This is the time to save innocent lives, innocent children. Very proud to propose.
Thank you. That was our Prime Minister, Rahul Gandhi, the 10-year student in environmental engineering. Let us now hear the leader of the opposition, Job Kimia.
Mr. Chair, we don't contest the idea that the situation in Syria is indeed regrettable because we recognize that it's pretty horrible and unhumane down there. But we don't think that now is the right time to intervene, but we won't rule it out in the future. We think this debate takes place in the now, where we are talking about what we already know and what we can possibly foresee. Therefore, we think, given the current climate, we don't think intervention in Syria is a strategic move for the international community. We think we're going to stick with current efforts of diplomacy. We're going to stick with talks, we're going to stick with negotiations, we're going to stick with peacekeeping efforts, but we don't think that the international community can go in and instigate military action against the Assad regime. Before I go on, a few rebuttals for the previous speaker. The first thing he tells us is that let's attack his proposal. Because the first thing he says, that the international community has overwhelming military might. But the first response is that military might is never just a justification or even a reasonable assumption for you to win a war. We've had people win wars with much cruder weapons, like in Vietnam, due to overwhelming numbers or due to national advantages. Because we think that's exactly the problem here in Syria, where a lot of the fighting is concentrated in the urban centers. Places where the Assad regime knows best, and places where you have the highest likelihood of civilian casualties. And we don't think it's a responsible move for us to say that it's okay to kill people on the ground. Second, they tell us that they're going to facilitate refugees at different borders. But they never prove to us that these Arab League nations are going to be willing to accept a massive exodus of people that they have to feed and clothe and protect into their lives. We think that's something that has to fly in their model. And I'm going to prove to you that these people obviously don't want that. Third thing, he tells us we're going to have UN peacekeepers. But this only works in the scenario where they have UN approval. They have to prove to us that if the UN says we don't care about their coalition, they have efforts to make sure that they can address that. Thirdly, he tells us that Assad can't rely on Iranian help anyway. We've already told you that with or without help from other countries, they already have distinct advantages and possess massive risks of collateral harm, something that any responsible actor in the international community would not risk having. Next, he told us that we're going to have defectors if we see that we're going to engage in Assad regime with international intervention. But we tell you, defectors are more likely to happen on our side. Why? We think intervention radicalizes people. We think intervention will cause more people to take up arms. These people may not necessarily be pro-Assad, but they're definitely going to be against anti-intervention, causing more people to take up arms and cause more conflict against Western troops and against civilians on the ground. But secondly, we think that when you ask people that you have to sit down and talk about these things, you make them rethink whether or not this war or this oppression that they're waging is actually worth it. So we think we actually give a better incentive for people to defect, a better incentive for people to comply with peace efforts. I'm going to argue three things to you today. First, on why war in the current context is not going to work. Second, why the coalition of the willing is virtually non-existent. Nobody is going to fight this war. And lastly, why diplomacy is the effort that we're most willing to take and why it's one that's most viable. On the first idea, why war is not going to work. But before I go on, sure.
Given that he has billions of oil dollars stashed away, what incentive does Assad have to back down?
We think, for example, that human rights violations have been committed in China, who has the largest economy in the world, lots of resources, right? But the point is, even if they're rich, over time you can get them to make concessions, like stop killing journalists, like open your markets to other countries. So we think diplomacy is reasonable. Let's weigh this later on in my third argument. Three reasons why war is not going to work. The first reason is because you can't compare this exactly to Libya. What we had in Libya were a lot of skirmishes and wars fought away from the urban centers in military strongholds in the wastelands and in the provinces. We don't think that you can have this in Syria, especially when the battlegrounds are places like Damascus and Homs where you have a high civilian concentration. And we don't think you can simply isolate the fighting there. We think it's important to consider these things because the just war theory states that one of the reasons why you go into war is to have a high reasonable probability of success. We don't think you can call it a success if you're going to have thousands of people in collateral dead at the end of the day. Second reason, we don't think we can intervene without a unified opposition. Why exactly is this important? We think we need important figures and bureaucrats to be able to take over once you settle down. So we're going to argue in a post-war scenario, something which they've never proven to us is actually going to materialize. We tell you that we have a lot, the Syrian opposition is factious. You have the Syrian Free Army, you have the Syrian National Council, you have the Syrian Transitory Council. Why is this important? Because we think they have different extents on whether or not they're willing to accept intervention, different extents as to how they foresee a particular government, and we think that without resolving these things internally, even if you do come in and intervene, you're going to have three new powers that are going to be fighting over the vacuum there, so what you're actually doing is making the war worse on the ground. But thirdly, even if there is a unified opposition, we think that because of its sectarian nature, these people are not going to perceive it as illegitimate. We think that a lot of these groups gain a lot of credibility from their home sects in Saudi Arabia. And whenever you prop them out officially, assuming you get the Arab League to come in, we don't think it's going to be seen as a legitimate government. It's going to be seen as an effort by the Arab League to further control and manipulate their lives. And we don't think that opposition is going to last very long. But thirdly, let's talk about geography. We think one of the biggest factors that limited The refugee exodus in Libya is that a large part of it was facing the Mediterranean Sea, right? But when you're talking about Syria, it's landlocked with countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, and Israel. And we think a protracted war is going to cause a massive exodus into these countries. They have to prove to us that these people are going to risk this war, with the possibility of accepting thousands and thousands of people flooding their borders, taking away security from their people, giving them more reasons as to their people questioning as to whether or not these people deserve protection in the first place. And we think more likely than not, these governments are going to side on the side of their people, telling them that we owe you our responsibility to protect you first, and we don't think we owe these refugees anything. But finally, why are we willing to go with diplomacy? We think diplomacy is a long-term effort, which is why you have a multi-year plan coming from Kofi Annan. But we think in the past, we've always had a high threshold for abandoning diplomacy, right? And we think if we throw it away right now, after 1 year after the Arab Spring, we think we're doing it a massive disservice. Because we think sanctions do work, and concessions do come from abusive governments. We've seen China relax its policies, we've seen Myanmar release Aung San Suu Kyi and actually hold free elections, and even if it came grudgingly from the military junta. What does this tell you? We think you can get diplomacy to get people to change. And from the opposition side, we prefer a few hundred deaths and some concessions over a decade or two, because we can't say that these regimes are absolutely going to stop. We think maybe the atrocities will still continue, but we think without antagonizing them, they happen on a much smaller scale. Whereas what they're proposing is that you throw away diplomacy, even though you've never really given it a chance, make military intervention your first option, and have 100,000 dead people on your hands just because you were impatient for things to work, just because you wanted to come in and prove that you're right. We don't think this is a battle of who has the bigger stick. It's about a battle of seeing whether or not you can reasonably convince a military junta to put down its arms. And we think you best do that when you feed them diplomacy, and that's what you get from the opposition side. Thanks.
There was someone who had just graduated with a degree in communication. Now, can we invite Deputy Prime Minister Rohan Jai?
He was right in saying that diplomacy is a long-term effort. What he needed to justify then is why is it right for us to wait so long when people are being shelled by tanks, ladies and gentlemen, when there's aerial bombardments of cities going on, ladies and gentlemen, when yesterday 59 kids innocently were hit by shells by the military army of Syria, ladies and gentlemen. They need to tell us why it's justified to wait so long. But more importantly, right, he never rebutted Rohit's analysis as to how this person has no incentive to give in to diplomatic pressure, ladies and gentlemen. Analysis came from Rohit to you that he has absolutely no incentive to make any concession whatsoever, ladies and gentlemen, because he knows without international military intervention, he will be able to repress this uprising in a matter of years, ladies and gentlemen. He has enough money stored outside to necessarily last that long. So we don't think diplomatic pressures will work, ladies and gentlemen. They need to give us more analysis on that end, ladies and gentlemen. But more importantly, right, a quick housekeeping issue before I move on to my issue. He said, well, if you're talking about peacekeeping, when there's no UN consensus, how will you do peacekeeping? We think peacekeeping happens post-conflict. We see no incentive for Russia post-conflict to drop any measures to stabilize Syria itself, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that point is moot. Let's talk about my few rebuttals towards them. First, about urban warfare. We think on the first level, ladies and gentlemen, when you take out high importance targets like tanks, like armored vehicles, like airfields, ladies and gentlemen, their ability to cause collateral damage towards Syria reduces. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we said that we are using the FSA to carry out this, which means, ladies and gentlemen, they are capable of understanding the terrain of the cities. We think, ladies and gentlemen, they will be able to do just fine. More importantly, we have done well in urban warfare in the past. In Iraq, for instance, ladies and gentlemen, we were able to minimize casualties to a very large extent, ladies and gentlemen, in the process of carrying out urban warfare. But lastly, we think, ladies and gentlemen, the moment we start enticing defections from the army, the sort of resistance that we will face will also rapidly go down. Rohit gave you the incentives for defections that exist under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen. We said that the Sunni majority army has no ideological allegiance to Bashar al-Assad. al-Assad, they don't want to kill their own Sunni brothers. The only reason they do so is because in status quo they are scared. Because they are scared of the repercussions that will fall upon their family, ladies and gentlemen. If this uprising is successful, and all trends in status quo points towards the uprising being unsuccessful. So we think, ladies and gentlemen, that the whole our whole point about defectors stands, ladies and gentlemen. They haven't proven why they will not be more defectors. The next issue, ladies and gentlemen, was about the civilian casualties. We said, ladies and gentlemen, that on the first level, we are going to be able to minimize them. That's what we've seen in past trends. But we think some amount is inevitable. You need to prove how you can show in less number of people dying when Bashar al-Assad has people bombing cities, ladies and gentlemen, on a daily basis. That's the fundamental difference on both sides. Let's talk about the two things I'll bring to you. The first level, ladies and gentlemen, I talked to you about the post-conflict scenario within Syria. Before that, yes.
Can you really sustain a protracted war when 3 weeks into the Libyan conflict, NATO ran out of bullets and the US isn't willing to risk another debacle like Iraq, and while they've abandoned virtually any kind of nation building in Libya right now?
Ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that's true. We think NATO has sufficient capability to carry out a protracted war, but we don't think this war will last long anyway. We think the moment we take out the high-profile targets like airfields, like anti-tanks and armored vehicles, we think people will begin defecting, ladies and gentlemen. We have seen signs of that. That's why the Free Syrian Army came into existence in the first place. We think that, ladies and gentlemen, this won't be a very long operation. Even if it is, we think the global community together has the capability. Let's talk about the post-conflict scenario and why we're better. On the first level, ladies and gentlemen, we think we are the people who empower them. Given that most of the tasks of carrying out this resistance against Assad is handed out to people like the Free Syrian Army in our paradigm, we think, ladies and gentlemen, we are the people who necessarily give the people on the ground ownership of this rebellion, ladies and gentlemen. And moreover, we think it's people on the ground who are asking for international aid, ladies and gentlemen, in the form of surgical strikes against Bashar al-Assad. We think under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, the sort of ownership that these people have is much greater. But secondly, see, timely international support makes people more malleable to the international community, ladies and gentlemen. When they see that the international community is willing to stand up to these people and stand up for these people, ladies and gentlemen, we think these people are more likely to then see the international community more favorably, ladies and gentlemen. They're more likely to be amenable to the sort of pressures put by the international community later on. We think then, ladies and gentlemen, the National Transition Council of Syria, for instance, who is currently united, we think under our paradigm we are going to strengthen it by taking people from the minority Alawite community as well, so as to put forward a united and uniform front to the people of Syria. We think, ladies and gentlemen, when the NTC sees that the international community has come on time and helped them, we think they're more likely to be malleable to the sort of reforms we suggested them. They're more likely to cooperate with the international community a lot more. That's much better under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we told you about the minorities itself. We think first and foremost that our model, given the fact that we created NTC that reflects the demographics of Syria, we think minorities will be protected better under our paradigm, as opposed to letting this be, ladies and gentlemen, where the resentment towards the minority increases. Because as Bashar al-Assad continues to carry out atrocities on its people, ladies and gentlemen, that's when the resentment against the Alawite community increases massively within Syria, ladies and gentlemen. That's what makes it extremely difficult for these divides to later on be seen, ladies and gentlemen. We think then under our paradigm, we make it much better. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's under our paradigm in terms of refugees, right? We think on the first level, because the conflict goes on for much lesser, because there's that diplomacy is a long-term process, we think the number of refugees will be much greater So we think it's under our paradigm that we minimize the number of refugees. But what about the number of refugees that will exist in both number of paradigms? We think, ladies and gentlemen, Turkey has already expressed interest in letting these refugees in and in taking care of these refugees. They're doing it in status quo, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, once we have an internationally coordinated effort, we have international funding to take care of these refugees, not Turkish funding, ladies and gentlemen. So we think there's greater incentive for people to go ahead and take them in. We think it's under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, that the number of refugees will be lesser because this conflict will end soon. Because they haven't shown, ladies and gentlemen, what's the timeline for this conflict ending under their paradigm. We think it's under their paradigm that this conflict goes on and on for years and years, ladies and gentlemen. Specifically, of the analysis Rohit gave you, that they never once rebutted. We think that under our paradigm, ladies and gentlemen, we do much better with the post-conflict scenario in terms of their love towards the minority communities, or in terms of the number of refugees that are created, ladies and gentlemen. We think we are superior. On the last aspect, ladies and gentlemen, as to what are the incentives of the international community, because that's the fundamental thing you need to recognize, ladies and gentlemen. Because we think on the first level, countries like Iran, for instance, aren't likely to intervene anymore, ladies and gentlemen, because they recognize on the first level that once we have an armed international intervention from abroad, most countries will back off. So countries like Russia, China, and Iran will back off the moment there's an international armed intervention for a couple of reasons. Because they cannot afford open conflict. Because when you analyze the incentives of each of these countries, a country like Iran is already in a lot of trouble, ladies and gentlemen, with their nuclear program. They're already trying to negotiate with the international community. So the moment they see international armed presence in this region, they're going to back off. When you talk about Russia, Russia and China, ladies and gentlemen, these are countries that lose nothing in causing diplomatic stagnation in the UN, but they lose a lot if they go into an armed conflict, ladies and gentlemen. We talk about China in the midst of a regime change, they cannot afford a sort of proxy war in this area. When we talk about Russia, who's just struggling with the poor economy, ladies and gentlemen, and also struggling with regime change issues, ladies and gentlemen, with lots of protests against Vladimir Putin, we think these countries will automatically back out, which means, ladies and gentlemen, we think we have a better chance of necessarily intervening successfully in Syria. We've proven to you, ladies and gentlemen, how in the long term we do much better in post-conflict scenario, how in the short term we stop the conflict. NTOA is extremely proud to propose.
Now I understand why the speaker is seated here and not upstairs. Thank you very much, guys. I'm told that he's a fourth year student in electrical and electronic engineering. Can we now invite the deputy leader of the opposition, Peter
The basic question they ask us is, why is it justified to wait? And I think the answer is very simple to everyone who has lived in a country where war actually happened. The idea that war in itself is an intrinsic evil, the idea in itself, Mr. Speaker, that when people are fighting and you have no escape, not because your state doesn't want to protect you, but even the people who are trying to protect you are the very same people who could be killing you. There are a number of things I want to talk about to the previous speaker. Firstly, they say that there are no trends by which we can say that there are actual changes going on. I want to give you 3 trends that's happened only recently in 2011. Firstly, we think there was a rebirth of free market capitalism when in Syria they reopened things such as casinos, multinational corporations and such. Second, in 2011 there was also the end of the 48-year state of emergency, which is something we would consider a massive development as far as the rights of the government are concerned. We think they've lowered a lot of barriers of the people on the ground as far as democracy is concerned, and they've lowered a lot of power struggle and power structure in their state. But thirdly, we would say even religious freedoms have now been on the rise in Syria. The idea that Syria has now rehired a lot of school teachers who were previously dismissed, for example, for wearing face veils, and we think that these trends give us an idea that concessions have existed, and we think that the fact that they do exist means that leaders are willing to change, and we think them to make absolute statements by which we think their arguments have been based on are not acceptable. But second, they talk about this idea that their policy will work because the only thing we need to do is take away high-profile leaders and everything will be okay from there. First of all, we really have to question again, and this was a POI I asked, to which we think there was no valid response. Who are the countries that are going to fight this war, and how successful will they be really? Because the military might that they're talking about is the military might of the United States, NATO, EU, maybe even Russia and China, all countries which we think have no vested interest to fight now, but in fact have an interest to veto the particular UN Security Council move to actually allow these wars to begin with. So, what did they say? Turkey has an army. Turkey has 11,800 soldiers, Mr. Speaker. We don't think they have any form of legitimate capacity to do what they did in Libya, for example. We think this is not winning the war by raising countries which have no might in the first place. Next, they say that defectors are going to happen anyway. What we would want to say is that as far as Syria is concerned, we think that there's a lot of rhetoric on the ground, whether it came from the government or people on the ground of an anti-international community one. The idea that they're anti-United States. So, assuming the United States was the one who supported your war, we think they're not going to be okay with that. But assuming the United States is not the one going to be participating in that war, how are they going to win? And we think the wreck of that war is not going to win them any war. But lastly, this idea of refugees, right? They say, well, what they're going to happen is this idea that there's going to be less refugees, and this was a massive assertion. We would say that logically speaking, when you participate in a war, that gives people a massive, great incentive to run away, Mr. Speaker. We think that when violence is less or gradual or something, Mr. Speaker, that can be prevented by not participating in a rally, we think the incentive for people to run away is going to be much bigger. When wars happen in cities, and even if you didn't want to participate, even if you didn't want to be there, strikes fear in the hearts of people, that is when people are going to run. But what do they say? Turkey has an express incentive to accept these refugees. If this is true, even under our policy, we think that apparently there is an asylum for these people and we think there will be no problem.
Sir.
Last rebuttal. They told us that what their policy will do is that because the military might is there, Russia, China, and Iran will back off. This first of all assumes that the might is going to be stronger than Russia, China, and Iran all combined.
Sir.
We think there are very few countries, either Turkey nor Qatar, have that might. But more importantly, who would want to antagonize these countries to begin with? Like the idea why we want a UN Security Council vote is the idea that we need to respect the notion that many countries are not willing to fight against superpowers like this. When Russia, China, and Iran are not okay with this idea, you have to give us a number of countries who are willing to face these countries even after this war goes on. No, please proceed. What am I going to talk about? What we want to say, Mr. Speaker, is the value of the UN approval. And we think that the UN approval gives us a very good message of an idea that post-construction will indeed happen. Firstly, what we want to compare, and I think that this is the meat of the debate, which we think they have not engaged in, is the difference of the interest of a UN and the difference of the interest of individual nations or coalitions of the willing. What is the calculus of coalitions or individual nations? There are two questions we want to ask. Firstly, which ones will participate? Which ones have invested natural interest to make sure, for example, that wars in these particular areas are not going to go larger and things like that? What they told us is the issue of refugees. This means that the number of countries that we can really factor in as people who are interested are people who are nearby. And like they said, Turkey and Qatar. We question, what is the incentive of Turkey to participate when they don't want, for example, to send a message of the idea that they want to involve themselves in so many regional issues, given the idea that they want to now participate in the European Union and so on and so forth. As far as Qatar is concerned, we think their military might isn't even strong. As far as the NATO is concerned, we think if you look at Libya, the Libya case study, what we can see is that they didn't even have the might to send soldiers because they didn't have the money, because of the European Union crisis and so on and so forth. But the second question we need to ask is, how far will they go? How far will the coalition of the willing go as far as rebuilding this entire nation is concerned when their only concern is to remove regional threat? What we will say, Mr. Speaker, to this particular idea is that when there is no more harm to their own nation, they're okay with leaving this particular nation behind. This is ultimately harmful, Mr. Speaker, because even if you can depose the leader, if you have no guarantee that people will invest in making sure the country will have an established government, we think the long-term harm is going to be even so much greater. But let's ask ourselves the calculus of the United Nations. When we ask all countries what their interest will be and whether they're willing to participate, we think that there are a number of ideologies behind it. The idea of rights, Mr. Speaker, the idea that we have a totalitarian perspective to see that we're meshing not only military might to depose leaders, but diplomatic, political, and social-economic incentives to make sure that these countries re-establish themselves in the long run. If we look at examples like Myanmar, for example, we think that there have been a lot of changes in Myanmar that did not necessarily need military might. And why is this so? We think, Mr. Speaker, that if you look at it, the trends in Myanmar can be credited to the idea that very few countries have tried to meddle in this issue. The ASEAN, for example, is non-interventionist. The less we pressure these leaders to use military might, the less these leaders will need to use might to scare people away. For all these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we think they still have not given us a group of countries which could reasonably win this war, and for all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose it.
I'm sure educators are only giving marks to what is being spoken and not unspoken language from the chairs. Can we have the government lead? Yes, welcome Sweta Balachandran.